I had always thought of this country house as my sanctuary, a place to escape from everything, from work, the constant noise of the city, and worst of all, from my increasingly crumbling family life. Wife, children, obligations. It had all seemed so right once upon a time, but with each passing year the emptiness grew stronger. I couldn't say it out loud, not even to myself, let alone to her, but with each passing day, I felt like an outsider in this role. Today, I finally escaped. My things were quickly packed, and the car was on the country road. It was one of those moments when everything happened automatically, as if my mind knew I needed to escape when I had the chance. When I got home, I took a deep breath. This house had always seemed like a sanctuary where I could catch my breath and briefly switch off from all my problems. But nothing happened when I walked inside and turned on the light. A click of the switch and silence. I tried again and again. The same dead silence. The power had failed. Great. Damn wiring, I thought, remembering how long ago this house had been renovated. Probably 10 years ago. My first thought was to call an electrician, but something in me resisted. I didn't want to see people or talk to anyone. However, the prospect of spending the night in the dark made me take a few steps back from that pride. I found the number of a local specialist and called. Half an hour later, I was told that someone would come. The wait was excruciating. Sitting on the floor, phone in hand, I couldn't help but wonder why exactly I'd decided to come here alone. Maybe I was looking for silence. Perhaps I had hope for something more than just temporary solitude. After all, maybe I was looking for something different. The engine's sound made me leave the floor and go to the window. The car's headlights illuminated the driveway in front of the house, and I saw the driver parked just outside the entrance. A man in a work uniform got out of the car, holding tools. I opened the door, and the cold evening air rushed into the hallway. "Good evening, have you called an electrician?" His voice was even and confident. "Yeah, looks like something was wrong with the wiring," I replied, trying not to sound too upset. After all, it wasn't his fault that things had gone wrong. He walked into the house and we exchanged quick glances. Tall, with a muscular build and slightly rough hands, the electrician clearly knew his stuff. His face was calm but focused. He introduced himself as Mark and I as Louis, and after briefly explaining where the electrical room was, Mark nodded silently and headed in the right direction. I noticed how his calmness relaxed me a little. The awkwardness was still there, but didn't seem so significant anymore. He quickly examined the panel, making a few notes on a notepad. I stood nearby in silence, watching his movements. His hands deftly sorted through the wires, and I couldn't help but notice how confidently he acted, as if he was born for such tasks. While Mark worked, I tried not to stare, but something about him caught my attention. He was reserved and withdrawn, as if protecting himself from unnecessary conversations. But this only made me want to get to know him more. At some point, he turned around and our eyes met. It was just a second, maybe less, but it was enough to feel a slight tension. I looked away, trying to appear calm, but my heart skipped a beat. "The wiring is old," he said, breaking the silence. "We'll have to replace a few cables, but it won't take long." "Of course, do what you need to." I nodded, feeling my heart beat faster. He continued working, and I stood beside him, watching his every move. There was something magnetic in how he moved, with complete confidence in every step. While he was explaining something about the state of the wiring, our hands accidentally touched as I handed him the flashlight. It was a brief, insignificant touch, but it caused me an unexpected surge of emotion. Mark didn't seem to notice, but I felt our tension rise. This moment left me slightly confused and thoughtful, and I no longer knew what to think about this situation. Mark continued to fiddle with the wiring, his movements precise as a surgeon's, and I couldn't take my eyes off him. The quiet room was filled with the soft sounds of instruments, but something was different in the air. It was a strange, tense feeling of anticipation that was growing with each passing minute. I tried to distract myself by walking around the room, pretending to be busy. Still, I found myself returning to watching him repeatedly. It was strange to realize that an ordinary worker, a man I hadn't even known an hour ago, was starting to make me feel so weird. Mark was calm, not paying much attention to me, but my heart beat faster every time his gaze lingered on me for a second. He leaned over the shield at one point, and I noticed a drop of sweat slowly sliding down his temple as he concentrated on his work. Unexpectedly, I thought I wanted to feel his touch again, a simple, unobtrusive touch, like when our hands had touched before. But what did it mean? I did not fully understand what was happening to me. "Everything is ready," Mark said suddenly, interrupting my thoughts. He turned to me, wiping his hands with a rag, and looked me straight. "The electricity should be working fine. I'll check a couple of switches." "Great," I replied, trying to speak calmly but feeling something tighten in my chest. He walked past me into the hallway, and for a moment, we were too close. At that moment, I felt his shoulder brush against mine. It was barely a touch, but enough to cause a stir. He didn't even stop. He just kept moving. But I still stood there, feeling his presence as if he had lingered a second longer. When he returned, having almost finished his inspection, I offered him something to drink, a typical gesture of politeness. Still, for some reason, my voice was awkward. "No, thank you," he replied, glancing briefly at the window. "But if I may, I'd like to use the shower. It's been a long day." A shower? I wasn't expecting such a request, but suddenly, something clicked in my head. I quickly agreed, trying not to show how nervous I was. Mark thanked me and headed for the bathroom, leaving me alone, where the tension had become almost unbearable. While he was in the shower, I stood in the middle of the room, not knowing what to do with myself. My mind was racing about why I was so bothered by his presence and its meaning. It wasn't just curiosity anymore. It was something more, although I couldn't admit it even to myself. And then I heard the water turn off in the bathroom. My heart started beating even faster. I heard a soft clicking sound outside the bathroom door, and moments later, Mark emerged into the hallway. He was wearing only a towel wrapped around his waist, and drops of water slowly trickled from his close-cropped hair onto his shoulders. His torso was impressive, with defined muscles but not rough, balanced and harmonious. The water rolled off his skin, glistening in the soft light of the lamps, and for a moment, I couldn't look away. "I'm sorry," he began, a little embarrassed. "I couldn't find a second towel. Do you happen to have a spare one?" My brain froze. All I could do was stand there and stare at him. It was a simple question, but in that moment, in that setting, it seemed like something more. Every movement he made seemed like it was in slow motion. His muscles tensed slightly as he turned to look at me, and I realized I had been staring for too long. "Ah, yes, of course," I muttered, fighting the sudden tremor in my voice. "I'll bring it now." I hurried to the bedroom to find a towel, but my thoughts were not about towels. What was happening to me? Why did his every move, every glance suddenly seem so significant? I wanted to believe that it was just the effects of a long day, of fatigue. But inside, I knew it was not so. This was something else. Deeper. Something I had not experienced in a long time. Or perhaps never experienced. Returning with the towel, I tried not to look at his wet body, but my eyes kept drifting to his bare shoulders and chest. There was an awkward silence in the air as I handed him the towel. Our hands touched again, and I felt an electric shock run through me. "Thank you," Mark said quietly, his gaze lingering on my face momentarily before he stepped away, wrapping himself in a new towel. I turned away, feeling everything inside me churning. On the one hand, I felt embarrassed for my thoughts and for allowing myself to pay attention to such things. On the other hand, something deep inside me pushed me to stop ignoring my feelings. When he returned to the room, already dressed, I felt the air become even thicker. He looked at me, and I knew that there was no longer that simple business-like distance between us that had been there at the beginning. Something had changed, and we both knew it. There was no point in pretending that I didn't feel it. Mark looked at me, his face slightly flushed as if he didn't know what to make of this moment. I collected my thoughts before speaking. You know, you can stay the night if you want. I mean, it's late and it's probably not worth going back. You can stay here. The words were out before I had time to think about them. I wasn't sure if I wanted him to stay or go, but I knew this moment had stirred something in me. Mark looked at me for a long moment, searchingly, and I saw the same question flashing in his eyes as mine. It was as if he too couldn't decide what to do. But something in his gaze became softer. "That would be convenient," he said at last, in a voice that held an uncertainty I had not expected. "If it wouldn't inconvenience you." "No, of course not," I said, trying to sound as calm as possible, although everything inside was seething. "You can stay. There are plenty of spare rooms in the house." There was a moment of silence, which seemed charged with something more than words. At that moment, I realized I no longer wanted to ignore what was happening between us. I stepped toward him, not knowing how this would end, but feeling like I had to do something. Mark stood there, motionless, and I suddenly realized how fragile this moment was. It all felt unreal. We had literally seconds to either move away from each other or do something that would change the situation forever. Something clicked inside me, and I was moving closer before I could even think about what I was doing. Mark looked at me, his eyes questioning, and I knew he felt the tension too. He was waiting as if for permission. My fingers involuntarily rose, and I touched his shoulder softly. It was a simple touch, but it felt so important. His skin was warmer than I expected, and at that moment, I felt an invisible thread form between us, preventing us from retreating. "Louis." Mark said my name quietly, and there was uncertainty in his voice, but also something more, a desire that he clearly could no longer hide. I froze briefly, then felt my fingers slowly slide down his shoulder. It was the most cautious, timid gesture, but felt incredibly intimate. I waited for his reaction, unaware I was holding my breath. Mark didn't pull away, didn't take a single step back. He just stood there, letting it happen. And then, unable to bear the silent waiting any longer, I took another step forward. Our bodies were so close that I felt the warmth radiating from him. We were both quiet. This silence was more than just a pause. It was an unspoken agreement, a moment that could become a starting point. Mark turned his head slowly, and our eyes met again, but his eyes were different this time. There was something in them I had never seen before, excitement mixed with a bit of fear, but also an undeniable attraction. I took the final step, leaning toward him, pausing momentarily to give him room to pull away and gently touching his lips. The kiss was brief and cautious, as if we were both testing the waters. But as soon as our lips touched, something about that moment changed. Everything else suddenly disappeared. This was more than just a kiss. It was release. Mark responded almost instantly. His previously tense and stiff hands suddenly rose, one around my neck and the other around my waist, pulling me closer. His lips were more confident, but still cautious, as if afraid to rush. We stood in the middle of the room like the whole world had stopped existing, and I couldn't believe it was happening. Our first kiss was gentle, but a power was hidden in every movement. I felt his breathing quicken, and my heart beat in unison. When we pulled away, Mark was still holding my shoulders, as if he was afraid that this was a dream that might disappear at any moment. "It's," he said quietly, his voice shaking. "It was—" I didn't let him finish. I gently touched his lips again. This kiss was a little longer, a little more confident. I could feel his tension fading, his fears beginning to let go. We were both on the threshold of something new, and I had made the right choice for the first time in a long time. Mark pulled away gently, his gaze filled with the same emotions that filled me. He looked at me as if he didn't know what to do now, but there was a sincerity in his eyes that I had never seen before. "Louis," he said again, quietly and slowly, "are you sure about this?" I knew he wasn't just asking. He was checking to see if I had any regrets, if it was all happening too fast. But inside me, there was no doubt. I knew it was the right move. "Yes," I answered. and this yes was so sincere that I surprised myself with my confidence. I'm sure. After the second kiss, we froze for a moment. The room seemed silent, and all my doubts and worries slowly disappeared. Being so sure of what was happening was a strange feeling. Usually, such moments should have been awkward, but this was different. Everything felt right. Mark still had his hands on my shoulders, his fingers softly brushing my skin, and the touch was so warm, so natural. I looked into his eyes, and his face reflected the same sense of relief that I felt. It was as if he, too, had let go of something he had been holding on to for a long time. We were both taking our time. There was no rush or sudden movements after these kisses, just calm. The tenderness between us was new to me, and Mark was also experiencing it for the first time. I stepped back and sat on the couch, gesturing for Mark to join me. He followed, sitting next to me, and I felt his hand slide over mine, lightly brushing against mine. It was a simple gesture, but it sent a warm wave through me that touched the deepest chords of my consciousness. We sat close, our shoulders almost touching, but neither dared to break the silence first. There was no need for words in these moments. What was happening now was enough. "It's unexpected," Mark said quietly, breaking the silence, his voice a little hoarse from the emotions he had just experienced. "Do you regret it?" I asked, although I knew his answer would be negative. Mark shook his head, his hand gently squeezing mine. The gesture was simple, but it had a power that I hadn't noticed in touch before. He looked at me and smiled slightly. "No, I don't regret it. I just didn't think it was even possible. For me." I knew what he meant. We were both going through similar internal conflicts, and knowing I wasn't alone was comforting. I felt even more connected to him. "I didn't expect it either," I answered honestly. "But to be honest, I'm glad it happened." Mark smiled again, and his hand tightened on mine. It was so intimate and touching that I felt my fears disappear entirely. We were just two people who had found something new, something meaningful. He turned slightly towards me, and I saw his gaze fall to my lips. My hand, previously unrestricted, slowly rose, and I placed it on his shoulder, my fingers sliding lightly down his neck. His eyes closed briefly, and I felt his body respond to the touch. Our lips met again, this time more confidently, but still slow and gentle. There was no rush in this kiss, only a desire to enjoy the moment and every touch. I felt his hands fall on my shoulders, and he lightly pulled me towards him. We both seemed to dissolve in these touches, leaving all problems, fears, and doubts at the door. Mark slowly pulled away when the kiss ended, leaving his hands on my shoulders as if he didn't want to let go. His eyes opened, and I saw the same feeling of calm that had filled me. "It's okay," he whispered, as if convincing me and himself. "Yes," I answered quietly. "Everything is fine." These simple words were confirmation that we were where we needed to be. We were together then, and there was no need for words or explanations. All we needed was time to get to know each other better, slowly and carefully, step by step. We continued to sit next to each other, embracing. This evening, which had started as a regular work visit, had become more profound. I felt my heart fill with warmth, and for the first time in a long time, I allowed myself to believe that this could be the beginning of something real. We spent the rest of the evening in silence, but the silence was no longer awkward or tense. It was warm, almost comfortable. Mark sat beside me, his hand still on mine, as if afraid to break the contact. I felt like, maybe for the first time, he'd allowed himself to be so open and vulnerable with someone. At some point, I noticed that the night had finally come. The darkness outside the windows merged with the soft light of the lamps in the room, creating a feeling of privacy, as if the world outside our small space had ceased to exist. "It's strange how everything turned out," I said, looking away but feeling his presence nearby. "It's strange but nice," Mark replied, his voice quiet, almost thoughtful. He looked at me and I saw something deep in his eyes, not just gratitude or joy, but much more, trust. Those words resonated with me. It was strange to think that this person I had only known for a few hours had become so important to me. It felt like a new connection, something natural and refreshing. We continued talking, but now the conversations became more accessible. We talked about everyday things, about life. Mark told me that he had always avoided talking about himself, afraid of being misunderstood and scared that people would judge him for his feelings. I listened to him, realizing that his fears were familiar to me. We both lived in worlds where being ourselves was not always possible. I haven't felt like this for a long time, I admitted, my words sounding unexpected. Mark turned slightly toward me, his hand squeezing mine lightly as if he wanted to tell me he understood. He didn't say anything, but his look was more eloquent than any words. I knew he felt it too, what was happening between us, and that it meant just as much to him. We both took our time. Our touches were careful, but every moment when his hand brushed mine or our shoulders brushed reminded me of how close we were. This wasn't a passion that suddenly flared up. It was a slow, gradually growing feeling I hadn't felt in a long time. When the clock showed late, Mark said softly, "I should stay the night if you don't mind." "Of course," I answered with a smile. "I already told you there's enough space here." We stood up, and I led him into one of the guest rooms. My hand was still on his back, as if I didn't want to let go. We both paused at the threshold, and in that moment, I felt our farewell dragging on. Mark turned to me, and our eyes met again. This time, there was no embarrassment or fear, only the certainty that there was already something more between us. "Good night, Louis," he said quietly, his voice almost soothing. "Good night, Mark," I replied, feeling how these simple words became essential to me. He smiled, and I turned to leave. But as I closed the door, I suddenly realized I didn't want to go. It was the first time in a long time that I felt I had found what I had been missing for so long. I returned to my room, but thoughts of Mark did not leave me. Everything that had happened that evening seemed unreal. Who would have thought that an ordinary visit from an electrician would turn my life upside down? Lying in the dark, I thought about what would happen next, and I was not afraid of this next for the first time in a long time. I was momentarily lost in the silence around me when I woke up the following day. The sun softly filtered through the curtains, casting a gentle light into the room, and I felt a surprising calm. For the first time in a long time, I woke up without the anxiety and heaviness that usually accompanied me every morning. Mark was still in the house. The thought made me smile, but at the same time I began to wonder, what now? What happens next? Last night seemed so significant, but at the same time I knew that our journey was just beginning. I stood up, threw on my robe, and headed into the kitchen, greeted by the smell of freshly brewed coffee. Mark was already there, standing at the stove, preparing something for breakfast. It seemed so natural, as if he had always been there. I stood there momentarily, watching him from the sidelines, and felt something warm and comforting spread inside me. He turned to me, noticing my presence, and his face lit up with a slight smile. "Good morning," he said quietly, his voice soft, as if we were both already accustomed to this new morning ritual. "Good day," I replied, coming closer and sitting at the table. "You got up before me." "Well, yeah," Mark chuckled slightly, turning to the stove. "I didn't want to disturb your sleep. I thought you needed to rest after everything yesterday." I watched him move around the kitchen and couldn't help but think how right it all felt. It had been a simple morning, but it had more meaning than most moments. What had seemed like a surprise yesterday was now the beginning of something new, and I was ready for it. We ate breakfast silently, but it was that pleasant silence where words weren't necessary. I knew something was real between us now, and Mark seemed to feel the same. He sat across from me, and I saw his gaze linger on me occasionally, as if he too was aware of how much things had changed. He began after a pause, trying to find the words. Everything happened so fast yesterday. I didn't expect that. Well, that it would go this far. I nodded, understanding what he was talking about. It was spontaneous, but it wasn't just a passing fancy. It was more than just a coincidence. I didn't expect it either, I said, but now I don't regret it. Mark looked at me, and his face softened. He reached across the table, gently touching mine, and I felt the familiar warmth of his touch. It was the same gesture he had made yesterday, but now he was confident. It was a sign that our acquaintance was not a coincidence, but a step towards something more. "What are you going to do next?" he asked quietly, his gaze sincere, full of interest and concern. I thought for a moment. All my old fears, which I had held on to for so many years, seemed to be fading away. I knew that I couldn't go back to my old life. Something had changed, and that change was necessary. "Honestly?" I replied, squeezing his hand back. "I don't know, but I want to know where this is going. I don't want it to end the way it started, spontaneously." Mark nodded, his face softening, and I knew he was thinking exactly the same thing. We sat there for a while, just enjoying each other's company. Everything seemed so natural, as if we had both been waiting for this moment our whole lives. And I knew that this house, which had once been my refuge, was the beginning of a new chapter in my life. When Mark packed his things to leave, I didn't feel sad. It wasn't a farewell, but a continuation of what had just begun. "I'll be waiting for your call," he said, saying goodbye, and I saw the same feeling that filled me in his eyes. "You will definitely get it," I answered with a smile. Mark left, but the feeling that we would meet again remained with me. I stood at the door, watching his car disappear around the corner, and I felt that my life had finally begun to change. And perhaps for the first time in a long time, I was ready for these changes.